German politicians, yes, yes, they're bringing back conscription. Germany's bringing back conscription, guys. Which means that there's going to be a war in Europe again. They had conscription from 1956 to 2011. The reason why the German government brought conscription in the 1950s was because they needed to make sure that the German military, the West German military in this case, was swelled up, that it had enough numbers. Because of the conscription policy in West Germany had an army of around over 500,000 people. They had an army of around 500,000 people, making it one of the largest Western militaries during the Cold War. So the German military was pretty big during the Cold War, around 500,000 people. The conscription policy was gotten rid of in the year 2011. Now the German military consists of, I want to say, over 140 or so thousand soldiers. Now the Germans are talking about bringing back conscription. Now, if you bring back conscription, the military numbers are going to swell up again. Germany is one of the most populated countries in Europe. It's probably the most populated country in the European Union, with over 80 million people living within its borders. With a population of over 80 million people, it wouldn't take much for Germany to gather up a significantly large military force. If you brought conscription, if you made a mandatory military enlistment, you could easily get over 500,000 soldiers and more. Easily. They are millions upon millions of Germans who are of fighting age, who fit within the age bracket that would be considered able-bodied for fighting. And it would be very easy for Germany to gather up quite a large military force. So that's what's happening in Germany. What's happening in Germany is the development of militarism, of going back to actually having a powerful military force. That's what's happening in Germany. And the thing is that Germany is the most powerful country in the European Union. And so the Germans don't only want to lead an army of Germans. They also want to lead auxiliary forces from the European Union, from the other militaries of the European Union. So in the united European force, you would not only have German soldiers, you would have Croatian soldiers, you would have Dutch soldiers, Danish soldiers, you would have soldiers from all the different various militaries that are under Brussels and effectively under German control, German power. So I want to read to you guys some things about this because I did gather some notes for this, and I didn't know if I was going to talk about this, but because Joshua George brought it up, I might as well just bring up my notes. So I gathered some notes for this subject. There was an article that was published very recently by the New York Times, and it talked about the formation of the German military in the Cold War, and it talked about how there is this rising culture of militarism in Germany. So it says here, talking about the Bundeswehr during the Cold War, it says, when the Bundeswehr was created in 1955, largely in response to American and British concerns about a potential Soviet invasion of West Germany, its officer corps consisted almost entirely of old Wehrmacht officers, including former SS men. Soviet leaders at the time portrayed the rebirth of the German military as fascist revanchism. So the Soviet Union said, hey, the German military is rising up again. 1955, 1956, the Germans enacted a policy of conscription. And the Soviet Union was saying, look, fascism is coming back because the German military is coming back. And the Soviets warned about, quote, the return of Hitlerism. Resistance to rearmament also came from a substantial swath of the war-weary West German population, fearful, as many are now, that it would provoke the Russians. So you had this huge anti-war movement. Of course, this is the 1950s. So the war ended in 1945. The war is still very, very fresh in the collective memory of the German people. A lot of Germans are anti-war. They want nothing to do with war. They don't want to see a revival of the German military. The Bundeswehr nonetheless grew with the help of conscription to include nearly 500,000 soldiers, becoming one of the largest militaries in the NATO alliance during the Cold War. So it didn't take much for Germany to make a big military. All it needed to do was enforce conscription, enforce military enlistment, and bam, you had around 500,000 people in the German military. It was the Russian threat that led to the resurrection of the German military during the Cold War. It's once again the Russian threat that may lead to its revitalization. So it was the threat of the Soviet Union that led to Germany enforcing military enlistment and gathering a military force of around 500,000 soldiers. Well, the Cold War ended. Conscription ended in 2011, and the Germans didn't see any purpose for it any longer. But we have a war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are at war, as everyone knows. That goes without saying. And so the Germans have been seriously talking about bringing back enforced military enlistment. And if they do this, and I believe that they will, this is going to swell up the German military ranks pretty high. On September 12th, Christine Lambrecht, Germany's defense minister at the time, addressed the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and declared that Germany must be willing to become a Führungsmacht, or leading power. So this has been a serious talking point in the German government. And it was expressed by Christine Lambrecht, but it was also expressed heavily by the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz. And he talked about making Germany the most powerful military force in all of Europe. Christine Lambrecht talked about making Germany a leading power, a Führungsmacht, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, within Europe. She acknowledged that this might seem alien to Germans. Well, given the fact that they led 2 world wars, it's not very alien to them. But that this uneasiness obscures something quite essential, namely that Germany de facto leads even when it does not want to. So even if Germany doesn't want to lead Europe militarily, it's still going to have to take such a position because it leads Europe economically. So being the industrial powerhouse of Europe, it eventually follows that it would be the powerhouse in military industry, thereby enabling it to becoming the leading military power of Europe. Should German leaders deliver on their promises, Germany would become the 3rd or 4th biggest military spender in the world. Before the war, such an increase would have been highly unpopular. But in a poll conducted for German public television soon after the invasion, 69% of Germans supported it. So 69% of Germans supported Germany boosting up its defense spending to where it would become the 3rd or 4th biggest defense spender in the world. So when people say, oh, look, most Germans don't support this, well, if you give them a big enough threat, they will. And in this case, the perceived threat is Russia. In a conference room with a map of Ukraine stuck on the wall above the copier, and this is what this journalist from the New York Times wrote, I asked him if he believed, and he's talking about interviewing this military official, and he says, I asked him if he believed Germans were embracing the idea that the country needs a capable military. This guy told this New York Times journalist, I think it's coming back now. Even parties that were not necessarily always behind the Bundeswehr per se, even there, real politik is now on the table where people say we need the armed forces. At the same time, it's hard to deny that now this is something very interesting that the article points out. It's hard to deny that a global arms spiral accelerated by the Russian invasion is already happening. Global military spending is now at an all-time high and rising. Japan, seeing threats from North Korea and China, is abandoning its post-war pacifism, vowing to double its military spending. That both Germany and Japan, two former World War II Axis powers, are now remilitarizing illustrates the degree to which the world may be reverting to great power rivalry with unpredictable consequences. So the fact that Germany and Japan are both reviving their military strengths tells us that the world is returning to rivalry between global powers. And what are going to be the consequences of this? We can't say for certain. But as the author writes, it's unpredictable. You could see a war between Japan and China. You could one day see a war between Germany and Russia. It's all very likely. So, it's very interesting. There was an article that was published on Foreign Policy, and this was published, I want to say, about a week ago. And it talked about how Europe could defend itself militarily without the help of the United States. And this is very, very likely. Now, people will sit there and say, oh, Germany has this, very, very aging population, and it's all just a bunch of old people. For one thing, Germany has over 80 million people. You can easily get millions of people, millions of young men to join the military. Not get them. You could force them to join the military. You could draft them. And Germans are a very conformist people. They have a very conformist culture. So it wouldn't be that difficult to force millions of young men to join the military. It just wouldn't. You could easily do it. So I don't really see how that's a legitimate argument. Another thing is, in addition to leading its own military, the Germans want to have a lead over auxiliary forces from Europe. So you could have Croatian soldiers being a part of this European military. You could have Bosnian soldiers, Albanian soldiers. You could have Danish soldiers, Dutch soldiers. In fact, there's already a program within the German Bundeswehr in which you have Dutch soldiers who have been integrated into the German military. So you already have cooperation between the German military and a non-German military. So this is not unlikely. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. In other words, you could see a repeat of what happened during the Third Reich, in which you had SS units that were from Croatia, from Bosnia, an Albanian SS unit. You had Romanian SS officers. You had Dutch, Danish, French SS officers. You had Ukrainian SS officers. You had all these non-German fighters who were fighting for Germany. And you could see one day a repeat of this. And I think that it's very, very likely that this will happen. So it's not just Germany. Everyone says, oh, Germany has a very dying population. It's a very aging population. It wouldn't be just Germany. It would be Germany and European auxiliary forces. And there's over 500 million people living in Europe. So with over 500 million people, you could easily amass yourself a huge army. So this article talks about how if the EU formed a unified military force, it would be a humongous, massive military power. Much more powerful than the Russian military. And it says here, at no point since the end of the Cold War has Russia's economy amounted to more than 15% of Europe's GDP. In 2021, Russia's $1.8 trillion GDP was a fraction of the European Union's $17 trillion GDP. So at no point since the end of the Cold War has Russia's economy amounted to over 15% of Europe's GDP. And it's very interesting because the Americans have always been worried about a rising European power. So it talks about an address that was made by William Cohen, who was U.S. Secretary of Defense, U.S. Defense Secretary in the early 2000s. And it says here, in his last address to NATO defense ministers in December 2000, U.S. Defense Secretary William Cohen warned that NATO, quote, could become a relic, unquote, if the EU built up what we labeled as a competing, redundant defense organization. Nearly 2 decades later, after the EU formed a joint fund for collaborative defense projects in 2017, a top U.S. defense official at the time commented that the plans must not distract from NATO's current activities. Quote, we don't want to see EU efforts pulling requirements or forces away from NATO and into the EU, said Katie Wheelbarger, the then Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. So the Americans, they want Germany to grow as a military power, but only as long as it remains under the thumb of Washington. America doesn't want to see a European power go rogue. But I think that's eventually what's going to happen. You're going to have this huge European bloc led by Germany. And America may not like it. It may not like it. But what the hell is America going to do to stop it? And I think the American point of view at that point would be, we have our own problems within our own borders. The Europeans have amassed this huge, powerful military. They have over 500 million people. They have solidified themselves as a very capable military force. Why not just allow them to go their own way? That way we can just watch as they act as a check against Russian advancement. And I think that's what the American point of view would be at that point. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.